On the loom at the moment, I'm weaving a blanket in this rather nice overshot design in some of our homespun wool and some cotton. In this case, this is an 8/4 cotton for the warp, and there's 8/2 for the tabby in the design. As is often the case with blankets, we want to weave something that's actually wider than our loom will allow for. I want my blanket to be about 4'6" wide, and obviously I don't have a loom that's 4'6" wide. So I'm weaving double cloth. Effectively, this means I'm weaving the blanket as if it was already folded. Here are my two loose edges, and over on the right is my folded edge. So we achieve this using a double weave technique. Effectively, we're weaving two cloths at the same time, one face up and the lower one face down, so that when we open it out, the pattern continues right the way along without any interruption or noticeable change. This, of course, means that at the folded edge, we don't want any drawing when we're weaving. Otherwise, that would be visible when we open the cloth. And if you look here, you can see there's no discernible change in the spacing of my warp threads. Now, that's quite difficult to achieve normally. So there are a couple of techniques I'm using here to make that happen. Firstly, if we look at the slaying of the reed, in general, I've got two warp threads going through each dent, but you can see for these last 4 threads in this case, I've halved that to 1 thread per dent. So effectively, the warps are getting a little bit wider, but the natural drawing means they end up being a consistent spacing. The second thing I've done is I've got what is effectively a floating selvage here. It's a piece of fishing line which doesn't go through any heddle, weighted off the back of the loom. And that is fairly tight, relatively speaking. It's quite a lot of weight on it. And again, that helps keep this folded edge pulled out, so there's as little drawing as possible. At the end of the project, this will just be pulled out of the cloth. That's why it's fishing line, very, very slippery, easy to pull out. And when we're weaving, we have to make sure that the shuttle always goes around that piece of fishing line. Whichever way the shuttle's coming, it always has to go around, unlike how we normally behave with the shuttle and the floating selvage. Over on the two loose end sides, because this is an overshot design, of course I need to have a floating selvage for all my wefts. And so because I have 2 edges of cloth, I have 2 floating selvages. So if we just look at the upper cloth, you can see there's the floating selvage here. I've got it in a slightly different colour warp. And the lower cloth, similarly, has its own floating selvage there. Now we have to be careful when we're weaving that those two don't get confused, otherwise we're going to interlock our wefts and we'll end up with a tube, not a folded blanket. So to keep them apart, there's another quick little technique. If we look at the upper cloth, you can see that the floating selvage here is actually being held up so that it's always in this slightly raised position. And that's achieved, if I just pull the beater forward, just by putting a little loop of string around it, and I've got that up and tied on the castle. And if we go back, the lower floating selvage is held down, again just by a piece of string behind the castle, tying it to the frame of the loom. So the 2 floating selvages are always held apart. When we're weaving, those 2 selvages behave exactly the same as they normally do when we're weaving. in as much as the shuttle enters over the top of the first floating selvage and enters the shed. Shuttle will then pass through the shed. As we've mentioned, it must come around the fishing line. It goes back into the shed and then it exits under your second selvage. On the return, exactly the same. Shuttle enters into the shed over this first selvage, passes around the fishing line and then exits under the second floating selvage. Right, so let's see that in action. So normally with our overshot design, there would be one pick with the pattern shuttle, this heavy wool, followed by one pick in the finer tabby cotton here. Then another pick in pattern and another pick in tabby. Now because the cloth is folded, each one of those picks becomes two picks, one from the first selvage to the fold, and then that continues from the fold back to the second selvage. So we'll start with pattern. Our shuttle enters over the first floating selvage, through the shed, and then it has to go around this fishing line. So I'm going to push that down with the back of my hand to catch the shuttle. So that is our first half of the pick, beat. And then for the second half, we're now going under the fishing line and as per normal exiting under the second floating selvage. So that is our first complete pattern pick. We now follow with the tabby, so over the floating selvage, into the shed, around the fishing line, and then back through the shed and under. So that is our first complete shot of tabby and pattern. And on the way back, over the first floating selvage, under the fishing line, and then over the fishing line and under the second floating selvage. That's our second pattern pick, and we follow the same procedure with our tabby. Over the first, under the fishing line, and then over the fishing line and under the second.